Hi, this is Andre. In recent videos, we've been talking about different types of MIDI messages and how they can be interpreted by a device to trigger different kinds of functions. In this video, we're going to look at the subject of choosing a controller for a particular device. There are a lot of different MIDI controllers available with a lot of options at various price points, but it's important to realize that not all controllers can send all types of MIDI messages or work in all kinds of situations. So we're going to look at some of the most fundamental big picture things to be aware of, with an aim towards narrowing down the vast array of available controllers into a small subsection that meets the requirements for controlling any particular device we want to. So the two most important things to look at are what kind of MIDI commands does the device that you want to control respond to, and does the controller you're looking at send those kinds of commands? That might seem like a total no-brainer, but the truth is that not all controllers will send all kinds of commands. This is especially true if you get into foot controllers. A lot of foot controllers are only really designed to send program change commands, which will change presets on a device, but a lot of them will not send any other kinds of data. Most of the hand controllers that are designed to be used with fingers and hands, those generally have a lot more flexibility as far as the type of information they can send, but they also tend to have a pretty big drawback, which we will talk about in just a second. So you want to make sure that whatever controller you're looking at will send the kinds of MIDI commands that the device you want to control will respond to. As far as what a device needs to see, generally the MIDI implementation is buried in the back of the manual. Pretty much every time I found MIDI implementation in the manual for a device, it's way in the back. So you may have to do a little hunting back there. Some devices will give you some flexibility in terms of you can send different kinds of commands and then you can assign one of those commands to a function. In my experience, most devices don't do that. Most devices have one very specific MIDI command that they need to receive in order to execute a certain particular function. You should also not assume that every function that's available on a device can be accessed through MIDI. Sometimes there are things that you can do through the main interface that are not MIDI accessible. Sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes there is functionality that you can only access through MIDI. So MIDI kind of opens up a whole separate category of functionality in those kinds of cases. But don't assume that just because there's a function on the physical interface of a device, then that therefore means that there must be MIDI available to control that function, because that's not necessarily going to be the case. Just like we need to do a bit of homework on what kind of commands the device needs to see to be controlled, we should also do a bit of homework on the controller involved. So you want to look at the specifications and find out what types of messages a particular controller can send. A lot of foot controllers only are geared towards sending program change commands because there's a certain corner of the MIDI pedal user world that just wants to change presets on their gear. So for people like that, it's fine to have a controller that only sends program change commands because that's all they're going to need it for. For people who want to access other functions, that's going to be a disaster. The only device I can think of that responds to program changes to actually get functions happening is the original Lexicon Jamman from the mid-90s. And I think they did that because, especially at that point in time, it was hard to find a controller that would send anything other than program change commands. So they thought, okay, we'll meet the user base halfway. You can use program change commands to access, record, and overdub and functions like that. That's very rare. Program change commands don't really have any duration to them. They tell you, okay, boom, here's a preset, but they don't really do anything other than that. So it's unlikely that you're going to find a device that will use program change commands for anything other than changing presets. So we want to find out what kind of commands the device needs to see, and we want to make sure that a controller we're looking at will send those commands. Just as important also is whether or not the controller will work with something other than USB. A lot of MIDI controllers, especially a lot of MIDI controllers that are designed to be used with hand and fingers, only have a USB port. They have to use USB not only to send MIDI information, but also just to receive power, to be turned on. They get the power from the USB port. If you're just using something to control a computer, then that's fantastic. You just have one USB cable into the computer, you've got the power source from there, you've got the MIDI going back and forth, so it's a very elegant solution. Most MIDI-capable hardware does not do that. Not a lot of hardware has a USB port on it, and if it does, you can't necessarily use it for MIDI control. For instance, the blooper does have a USB input. This does not let you do any MIDI control. This is just so that you can edit the parameters and update the firmware. The Poly Effects Bebo does have a USB port, and you actually can connect a controller into that. So I've actually run a USB cable from the Beat Step directly into the Poly, and that worked, and that was great. It's a very elegant solution in that way. That's unusual in my experience. There's also cases like the Soma Cosmos, which does have a USB port, but you can see the warning, flash drive, exclamation points. According to the Soma manual, if you plug a computer into the USB port on the Cosmos, you can break the Cosmos. So the USB port there is just designed to receive flash drives to change the firmware version that you're running. Now, there are a couple of ways that you can make a USB-only controller work for hardware that doesn't have a USB input. One is to basically use your computer as a glorified MIDI through box. So I've done that sometimes. I will run a USB-only controller into my computer. I like to use Ableton Live just because it's very easy to configure MIDI that way, and I will configure it so that it takes the incoming MIDI signal from a controller and then immediately routes it out through a MIDI interface like this. This is 5-pin MIDI DIN or DIN, 5-pin DIN, I like the sound of that, on one end, and it has a USB input on the other end. This will not work. If you plug a USB controller in on this end and then plug that into a device with a 5-pin MIDI input, that's not going to automatically translate it for you. So this kind of interface is designed to be used with a computer. But it will do that if you run a controller through USB into the computer and then route that MIDI signal through the output and send this to some kind of MIDI device that takes 5-pin inputs. That can work fine. Now, there's also a category of boxes that will take USB MIDI and convert it into 5-pin MIDI. So it has a USB input, you plug your USB controller into it, and then it has outputs in 5-pin. And I don't have any experience with those. What I do know is that the cheapest that I have seen those boxes be is about $50. And when I have been looking at controllers over the last year, I ultimately felt that I was looking at controllers mainly to control looping hardware, not software so much, although I have done that a little bit. But I was mainly looking for controllers for hardware, and my feeling was that if I was going to have to spend an extra $50 plus to make something work with my hardware, then I would rather put that money into getting a nicer controller rather than getting a cheaper controller and then putting another $50 or more into getting a converter box so that I'll actually be able to use the controller with my hardware. Now, when it comes to non-USB MIDI connections, there's basically two ways that things get connected. The most traditional, the oldest way, is through a 5-pin cable, 5-pin DIN or DIN. I'm embarrassed that I don't know how it's pronounced, but hey, I don't know how it's pronounced. A more recent technical development is sending MIDI over TRS, tip ring sleeve connections. So for instance, this is a cable that goes from MIDI to a TRS connection. TRS MIDI can be sent through either 1/4-inch cables or 1/8-inch cables. Different devices have different inputs. So the blooper, for instance, this is its TRS MIDI input, and that's a 1/4-inch input. I would say it's more common to find devices that have 1/8-inch inputs and outputs. The Zoya, for instance, has MIDI, but those are TRS in and out. What's also pretty common is that a lot of devices will have converter cables, adapters like this. This is one that came with the Arturia Beatstep. This is one that came with the Empress Zoya. So basically the idea is you can plug a TRS connection into the device and then plug a 5-pin cable into this end, and then you can make connections that way. One thing to be aware of when it comes to TRS MIDI is that there are two types of TRS connections. One is called Type A, one is called Type B. They look exactly the same, and you're not really going to know which is which unless they're explicitly labeled as such, or if you try one of each kind and you figure out which one works and which one doesn't. From my experience, most controllers that use TRS in and outs for MIDI come with converters or adapters like the ones we were looking at so that you can access 5-pin connections directly through that. The opposite could also be true. You could have a controller that has a 5-pin output, but then you want to control a device that has a TRS MIDI input. So there again, you would need some kind of adapter to go from 5-pin to TRS. It would probably be a Type A, but not necessarily. So again, doing a little bit of homework and due diligence in this kind of thing is a really good idea. So these are the big picture aspects of MIDI controllers that I feel are most important to get taken care of initially. There are many other variables to how a controller can function, and although most of those details are relatively minor, there are still things that can impact the overall performance experience. So we'll be delving into further subtleties of controller characteristics in videos to come. In the meantime, as always, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.